In this episode of MGM HD's original series, Backlot, go behind the scenes of one of the studio's greatest cinematic achievements, West Side Story. One of the most critically acclaimed musicals of our time, West Side Story is best known as a breakthrough feature film, yet it actually started out in 1957 on a Broadway stage. West Side Story is a classic tragedy of forbidden love, where two teenagers connected to rival New York street gangs fall for each other. Unlike the more celebratory and simplistic musicals of its time, the story deals with tough issues like racism and violence, set against a backdrop of clashing ethnic cultures. Pow! Its modern edge, music, and dance revolutionized the language of musical theater on Broadway forever. Critics hailed West Side Story, and after hundreds of Broadway performances, the musical's excitement and innovation led MGM's United Artists to make West Side Story into a feature film. But the complexities of transposing it from the stage to the screen posed great challenges. It required engineering brand new shooting techniques, some of which are still being used today. Add to this the clashing artistic vision of the directors, plus the bruised egos of on-camera personalities, all of which eventually led to a key player being forced out. Despite the conflicts, the result was a hit feature film, which went on to win 10 Oscars and continues to be a phenomenon today, 50 years later. Next up, meet the people whose brilliant collaboration forged a unique artistic achievement on MGM HD's original series, Backlot, West Side Story. West Side Story is widely known as a breakthrough feature film, yet it was originally conceived as a musical for the Broadway stage.
The idea came from Romeo and Juliet. Way back in 1947, I was asked to read it by a friend of mine who was offered the role of Romeo for a Broadway production. And in reading it and thinking about, well, if I were an actor, what would I do to make this immediate and alive to me? First thing I thought about, well, what if it were happening today?
Jerome Robbins set out to accomplish what had never been done before in a Broadway musical. His innovative concept was to take Shakespeare's timeless love story and weave it with contemporary topics of gang violence and prejudice. To do this, he recruited some of the most forward-thinking artists of his time.
I felt no one could write it better than Arthur Lawrence or compose music for it better than Leonard Bernstein, so I immediately ran to them with the idea. And then Arthur and Leonard came up with the idea of changing it into the gang warfare, which was very prevalent and I think a wonderful idea.
We wanted to be good. That was more important than being successful. And I don't believe in many principles. The one I do believe in is that content determines form. And it was the content that really shaped the form of this piece. You couldn't do a story where there were going to be murders and an attempted rape, and there's bigotry and hatred. You couldn't do that in conventional musical comedy style.
To embody the emotional depth of the story, Leonard Bernstein broke new ground by creating musical counterpoints that ranged from edgy gangland rhythms to melodic romantic arias.
The best thing about West Side Story is the score. I think it's absolutely brilliant theater music, and no one has ever equaled it. Who would have imagined the quintet? You don't imagine things like that till somebody brilliant writes them. A boy like that, what kind of a duet is that for a musical? But it works, and he wrote it. And then when the orchestra starts, you're ready to jump out of your seat.
For Bernstein, West Side Story presented an opportunity to bring bold new sounds to the Broadway stage.
All Lenny cared about was that his work should be taken seriously. He had been so often slammed by the critics for doing popular and serious work. It was verboten, still is, with critics. If you're popular, that's one thing, and if you're, quote, serious, that's another, but you can't be both at the same time.
Tailoring character-specific lyrics to Bernstein's score, Stephen Sondheim captured the essence of the story in his musical debut.
Steve is almost the only lyricist who writes songs that can only be sung by the character they're intended for.
I find that the best way to make a song belong to a character is to let the author develop the character, put him in the situation, in the scene, and then once the scene is written and I know the way the character not only talks, but thinks, then I can start to write the lyrics.
Coming to me. Could it be? Yes, it could. Something's coming, something good. If I can wait, something's coming. I don't know what it is, but it is gonna be.
There are songs like Something's Coming, which have a huge Steve identity, as well as Lenny's. So I think it was a very good marriage.
10 years in the making, Jerome Robbins' vision became West Side Story, the Broadway musical. It went on to be applauded on stages from coast to coast. The play's transition to the big screen began when Hollywood producer Walter Mirisch took the project to MGM's United Artists. They greenlighted it immediately. Mirisch wanted Jerome Robbins to choreograph the feature film, but Robbins wanted more. He wanted to direct. So Robert Wise was brought on to co-direct and be responsible for the dramatic sequences, while Robbins would direct the music and dance scenes.
Robert Wise, at that time, was a very established director. And Jerry, this was his baby. He wanted it the way he wanted it to be. And Bob Wise was very in touch with what Hollywood needed done.
Yet Robbins found it difficult to translate his sophisticated choreography from the stage to the streets of New York.
It was so complicated. You would think it wasn't, because you have a great hit coming off of Broadway, a musical, and then move it to the screen. That sounds simple, but it's not.
Well, Robert Wise told me that with the prologue, he was the one that put that on Jerry's shoulders, and Jerry kind of shrugged it off and said, well, you've given me the biggest challenge right off the bat, which is how to put this realistic New York urban setting together with the stylized dancing, and how can we get the audience to accept that? The way it was done was very slowly. You see the gang coming down the street, and the music is in the background, and it's one shoulder move or one finger snap, and it slowly evolves into all of the action from there. And that was really a stroke of genius that was Jerry Robbins.
Originally, the master shot followed us all the way down the street. It was a whole block of dancing, and it was in the summer. It was like 110 degrees, so it was extremely hot and painful to be dancing on cement all day long.
Rehearsals took place in the actual streets of Manhattan.
Jerry and Bob Wise would have their viewfinders and look at us, trying to figure out, what angles to shoot us at. And then they'd break up and we'd do lots of different angles. And that came from Robert Wise. One of his theories was you could never have too many different angles. And Jerry really took him up on that and wanted even more, I think, than Bob did.
To capture the explosive energy of the dancers, Wise and Robbins collaborated to come up with original filming techniques, including shooting particular angles from cranes to digging trenches and shooting from ground level.
The prologue, I think, took 2 months to sort of choreograph before we even came to New York. And then when we got to New York, it was changed daily by what the shot looked like and by what the street was. That was Jerry. He just wouldn't settle for anything but perfection.
Up next, there's tension on the set. Find out what caused some actors to break down and others to catch their big break.